Well, hello there. This video is essentially to help you understand and be able to answer the short answer questions for the upgrade course as part of your TAE upgrade. Now, whether you are doing the GAP assessment or you're doing the ASS 502 assessment, the assistance that we provide in this video is going to be extremely valuable for you and hopefully will give you enough of a boost to be able to answer the questions by accessing the textbook and also the prompters that we give you in this video. So definitely as we go along, have a pad and pen ready and be taking notes. Also, feel free to actually pause the webinar at different places and answer the questions as we are going along in the video. As always, if you have any questions at all, feel free to always send through an email or give your trainer a call and they will be more than happy to help you out. You can also post a question in the forum and you will have an assessor get back to you. However, our belief is that there's no excuse for not progressing because the answers and support are always available. You've just got to reach out. So this video is one of those examples of just us wanting to support you through your journey as much as we can. So for the upgrade course, you'll be looking at these particular units here and this cover sheet. Make sure you do fill it out and make sure you sign it and put the date that you sign it. That would be really, really important. Okay. So as we go through these, questions, we are expecting you to answer the questions to a Cert 4 level. And what that means is essentially you're going to answer it in two or three sentences. You're going to answer it in good quality detail and provide examples where required. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack each of the questions for you. And I would expect that you're taking notes and be taking down as much information as you can. Okay, now through the video will also be guiding you towards the textbook and encouraging you to check that out as well. All right. And if you need electronic copies of the textbook, feel free to reach out and ask us as well. Okay. So part one, knowledge questions, number one here. So it says list 6 components of an assessment tool and describe their purpose. Okay. So if I was answering this question, I would think about, well, in an assessment tool, what are the key sections or components? Okay. So I'm just going to throw some ideas out there and you can obviously expand on them. All right. So in an assessment tool, you may have, for example, instructions to assessors. Okay. You may have instructions to candidates. You may have policies and procedures. You may have benchmark answers, okay, and marking guides. You may have hint, hint, nudge, nudge, mapping, okay. You may have a student declaration, okay, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. You may have, let's see, what else have we got? Information about safety. Okay, you may have information about submission of assessment evidence. Okay, you may have information about expectations for competency. Okay, so hopefully there's enough there for you. If you want, feel free to also go to Google and type in assessment tool components and see what comes up. Obviously, as I've said those, you wouldn't just put in that as your answer. You would also want to describe its purpose. Okay, so just to give you one example, if we said in one example here, it would be, say, instructions to assessors. You could say as a description, the purpose of instructions to assessors is so that the assessor knows exactly how to conduct the assessment, what's required of them, and how to conduct it in a compliant and effective manner. Okay, or something to that effect. Just as another one I thought about just now is reasonable adjustment. That's another one that you could talk about as well. All right, so coming down, let's tackle question 2. All right. So question 2 here, it says list the 4 principles of assessment and what do we look for in assessment tools or instruments during a validation activity? Describe how each is applied when developing assessment tools. Okay. So hint, hint, nudge, nudge. If you go to Google and type in principles of assessment, you're going to find the 4 of them. However, I'll give you a strong hint for them right now. So first one is valid. All right, we got some flexible, we got reliable, and we've got fair. Okay, now valid, as we say, is about making sure that the assessment actually assesses what's in the unit of competency. So if the unit of competency talks about, let's say, swimming pools, and in your assessment, you talk about lakes or rivers, well, that assessment is not going to be valid. All right. It's a very crude example. However, essentially valid means that what's being assessed is actually what matches what's in the unit. Okay. So if we were looking at during validation, essentially, we want to put in some wording around the fact that we want to check that the assessment reflects what's actually in the unit, and all the assessment questions actually align back to the unit. Okay, so when developing assessments, well, how would we make sure that happens? Well, we probably create some mapping. We probably get a third-party perspective on it, get other people to look at it, all right, and make sure there's good alignment there. Okay. So flexible. Flexible is related to, is RPL provided? Are all learners, I guess, is there contextualization available? Is the where and how, is that flexible as well? Okay. So again, is RPL available? Is it contextualized? And is the where and how flexible? Okay. So in validation, how would we check that? Well, we would literally look through the assessment to see, is the where and how flexible? Is RPL mentioned? And we would actually review the assessment for those things. Okay. When developing assessments, well, we're going to make sure that the where and how is flexible. We are going to make sure that RPL and the process for that is mentioned, and we are going to make sure that the assessments are justifiably contextualized or sufficiently contextualized. Okay, coming down, we got reliable. Now, reliable relates to, are all assessments, would they be used by all assessors in the same way? Okay, so would all assessors use the assessments in the same way? If yes, it's reliable. If no, then no. Okay, and also, would all candidates get very similar answers? All right, so how do we check that during validation? Well, we would want to make sure that the assessment instructions to the assessors are very clear. Okay, we would want to make sure that the assessment instructions to the candidates are very clear. So, for example, in the instructions, does it talk about specifically how long the assessment should go for? Does it talk about the equipment that must be available? Does it talk about, is there very clear benchmark answers for anyone that's marking the assessment? Okay. So when we're developing assessments, how do we make sure they're reliable? Well, we make sure that there are clear instructions in the assessment. We make sure that there are very specific benchmark answers. Okay. And we make sure that there are very specific instructions for the candidates about what's required. Okay, so pop that in your own words, obviously. Coming down, fair. Now, fair is about making sure that there is reasonable adjustment considerations available or facilities available. Fair is about making sure that no one is discriminated against. Okay, so how have we checked that in validation? Well, we would check that reasonable adjustment is mentioned. Okay, we would check that in a languaging, no one is discriminated against. Okay, then how do we make sure of that when we are developing assessments? Well, we build reasonable adjustment into our assessments. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a good explanation about principles of assessment and how you would build that into your assessments and check it in validation. Okay, so coming down, question 3. List the 4 principles of evidence, the rules of evidence, and explain why we apply them in designing an assessment tool. Describe how you would evaluate an assessment tool to ensure it meets the rules of evidence. Okay, so hint, hint, nudge, nudge. The rules of evidence are valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Okay, if I can spell correctly. Okay, so now valid. Basically, the rules of evidence are the criteria that we use in order to mark an answer. Okay, and it is the criteria that we are using in order to decide whether or not an answer is good enough. Okay, so essentially, it is the benchmarks or the criteria that we always come back to decide is if a student answer is satisfactory or not yet satisfactory. All right. So valid relates to whether or not the answer is correct. Okay. So when designing assessments, we want to make sure that there is clear instructions in the questions. We also want to make sure that the benchmark answers are correct or are clear and correct. We also want to make sure that there is very clear. We want to make sure that they're very clear mapping and making sure that the items in the unit are clearly mapped when building the assessments. Okay. Now, during evaluation, this again probably relates to the mapping side of things, and during validation or during evaluation, reviewing the mapping to make sure the mapping is correct and the mapping is covering every item in the unit. Okay. Authentic. This is about making sure that the candidate's candidate is work or evidence that's being provided is the candidate's own work and there is no plagiarism. Okay, so when we are designing assessments, how do we make sure that we are checking for that? Well, we would have a student declaration. We would include a student declaration in the assessments. Okay, during evaluation, well, we want to check that a student declaration is available. And we would want to check that that had been signed if we were reviewing a student's submission. Okay. Current. Well, current is about making sure that the answer is up to date and that the evidence provided is up to date. Okay. So how would we make sure that the student is always providing up-to-date work? Well, we would do that by making sure that when we're designing the assessments, there is a date available for the student to fill out. All right, so there's a date space for them to fill out. Okay. Also, we can make sure that when we give the instructions, we can say, your evidence must be from within the last 6 months or the last 2 years or the last 5 years, whatever it might be. Okay. During evaluation, again, in here, we could say when reviewing the assessments, we check that the date section has been completed by the candidate. All right, coming down, sufficient. Sufficient is related to, is the answer long enough or has enough evidence been provided? So when thinking about when meeting this criteria when designing assessments, we would want to do things like include a word count for the questions, where to encourage learners to put answers that are long enough. So such as answer the question in a minimum of 100 words or in a minimum of 300 words. All right, so that's going to increase the probability of sufficiency or sufficient length of answers for the learners in their answers. Now, in evaluating, or so during evaluation or validation, in here in this box, we could talk about checking that students have supplied enough evidence, i.e. answers are long enough, or in the case of RPL, if the assessment asks for 3 examples and the candidate only gives 1 example, well, that's not going to be sufficient, okay? Also, let's go in a typical assessment, maybe it's an observation, maybe the candidate's only been observed once, but they actually need to be observed 3 times, okay? So like checking that the candidate has been observed enough times, or they have supplied enough evidence, all of that is going to relate to sufficiency. All right, so coming down, question 4, describe the assessment tool you would need to develop for the following example. Context, you've been asked to assess a person's ability to complete workplace documentation. The candidate is an office administration assistant at a local business building supplies retailer. Okay, answer. So let's imagine it could be Bunnings or something like that, right? So there could be multiple different possible answers for this question. And I'm just going to give you some possible answers. And if you have something different, that's okay, because as we all know, when we're assessing different things, there's multiple ways that we could interpret that and come up with different assessment methods, so to speak. Okay. So what methods would you use? All right, so what have we got? Ability to complete workplace documentation. So possibly what we could set up is a project. And as part of this project, they need to, we could go project, or we could go case scenario or case study, and we provide them with instructions, and they need to complete a range of documents, okay? So these could be maybe an invoice, a receipt, a purchase order, and maybe even just, what else we got? Message on the telephone, okay? Or another workplace document that comes to mind, maybe it is filling out a memo for someone else or something like that, right? And then as part of that, we would have some marking criteria for each of the documents, okay? And maybe there's a case study around each of the documents, and there's a bit of scenario, and they need to fill it out completely and make sure that they hit each of the key points from the scenario, okay? What instruments best suit those methods? Well, probably the instruments would be, as I said, a case study, a case scenario. Maybe there is possibly a written test, and maybe a marking guide for the written test. Okay, and there's definitely going to be a marker's guide for the case study. Okay, there would also be a task sheet that would describe the case study, for sure. What activities would the candidate have to complete? Again, this can be left up to your imagination, but it could be anything that would be related to what else we got? Local business suppliers, retailer. So it could be purchase orders, it could be emails, it could be creating invoices, purchase orders, receipts. It could be responding to customers. So yeah, those kind of things. What is the context? Where, when, and for how long? All right. So you could say, okay, this could be a, let's go, a project, and maybe it could be for like a week. And over that period of the week, they are answering those case studies, or it could even be a 2-week workplace project where they have to gather evidence of the things that they are doing or have done, and you actually list out those items that they need to gather from the workplace. That's another strategy or way you could approach it. Okay. And again, you could have different answers to what I'm proposing right now, but we just want to make it as relevant to the building suppliers as we could. Okay. And thinking about, okay, what kind of documents would be applied or would be utilized by a staff member in that context. All right, number 5, how would you address dimensions of the competency in your assessment tool? Ensure you address each of the 4 dimensions in your answer. Okay, so number 5 here, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. If you go to Google and type in dimensions of competency, you will obviously find those dimensions of competency. But let me give you a hint. Task skills, task management, contingency management. Okay. And last of all, job skills or job environment. Okay. Now, let's come back to the basics. All right. And let's come back to what the dimensions of competency actually are. And if we put this in very plain language, we could say that the dimensions of competency are: how do you know that the person can do the task? How do you know the person can actually do the task from the unit of competency? And essentially, these are 4 criteria that we have in the back of our mind, and 4, I guess, aspects that would show us that the person can actually do the task. Okay. Now, it may sound like a convoluted way of thinking about it, but essentially, if we break it down, it makes quite a bit of sense. Okay. So task skills is essentially that they can complete the task. So for example, if we're talking about forklift driving, task skills will say, all right, they can drive the forklift from point A to point B. Task skill, that's it. All right. They can do the task. They can complete the task in action. Task management is they can do the task, they can prepare for it, and they can also complete the task, and they can handle things that are going on around them at the same time. So if we talked about the forklift, we could say task management, they can prepare the forklift to be ready to drive it, okay? They can, at the end of driving it, they can shut it down and do what is required to put the equipment away and complete the task. Now, also, as part of that, they can handle it when other things are going on around them. Okay, so for example, maybe there's other people around them and they can drive the forklift around what's going on, or maybe there's different conditions that they need to drive it in. Okay, now contingency management is they know what to do if something goes wrong. They know what to do if something goes wrong. Okay, so contingency management is the ability to manage things when things go wrong. So maybe the forklift tips over, okay? Maybe it runs out of petrol or gas or whatever it might be, okay? Job skills, job environment is, can they do the task in multiple environments or job settings, okay? So can a person drive the forklift inside the factory and outside the factory? Okay, that's essentially what job skill, job environment comes down to. Okay, so now let's come back. Okay, so how would you address dimensions of competency in your assessment? First one, task skills. Well, my suggestion would be make sure that your instructions are very specific and tell the candidate the when, the how long, and the equipment that is required to do the task. Okay, task management. In your assessment, make sure that you also mention what is required to prepare to do the task, and also what is required for finishing off the task. Okay. Contingency management. In here, maybe in your assessment, you build in some scenarios where things go wrong. Okay, so maybe if it's CPR, maybe you build in some scenarios such as when a casualty vomits post resus. Okay, or maybe in the forklift, maybe you build in a scenario where the forklift runs out of gas. Okay, so contingency management is about testing your candidate to see, can they handle difficult situations or unexpected situations? Job skills, job environment. Well, you would include in your assessment different environments for the person to do the task in. All right. So maybe in one scenario, they do it in the factory, another scenario, they do it somewhere else. Okay. And making sure that you do test their ability to perform the task in multiple environments. Okay. Hopefully that's given you a good understanding of question 5 here. Question 6. List the components of a streamlined unit of competency and give a brief description of each. Okay, so I'm going to give you the components or some of them, and you're going to go to Google for this, because what I strongly suggest is if you go to Google and type in streamlined unit of competency, and you're going to find most of the descriptions. You're also going to go to the textbook, and in the textbook, you will find it in the chapters there. But if for anyone that does not have the textbook, you'll be able to go to Google and type in components of streamlined unit of competency, ? And see what comes up. But essentially, we are looking for things like the elements, okay, performance criteria, okay, performance evidence, okay, knowledge evidence, assessment conditions, okay, and there are a few others as well that you can definitely add. And we are encouraging you to go to Google and find a description of each of these. And if you've been in the training sector for a little bit of time, you probably would have an idea as to what these are. Okay, cool. So if we come down, number 7, explain how you would use the assessment requirements of the unit of competency to guide the development of your assessment tools. Okay, well, if we reflect back on a unit of competency, we would all know that there's some core components, which are the assessment conditions, the performance evidence, and the knowledge. Okay, so those are the core components of what needs to be assessed from a unit of competency. So essentially, I'll just break it down for you. And obviously, when you answer it, you're going to expand your answer a lot more than this. But I'll give you some prompters. So the assessment conditions tell us the where, a little bit of the how, but where, how, and possibly who can and should and must assess a candidate. Okay, so essentially under what conditions the assessment must take place. Okay, performance evidence tells us what we must see the candidate actually do and perform in front of us or in front of the assessor, so to speak, and what actual evidence we must tangibly see, so to speak. So performance evidence is, it could relate to practical performance. So you may need to actually watch someone do something. All right. Or they may need to produce something. So for example, they may need to organize a meeting and you may need to watch them organize the meeting or take meeting minutes or whatever it might be. And also as part of that, maybe they need to actually produce a meeting agenda. Okay. So performance evidence is essentially what do they need to produce or show you or do in front of you to prove that they are competent. Then the knowledge evidence side of things is what do they need to know in order to be able to do that task? Okay, so when we talk about assessment requirements and answering this question here, well, we could say that the assessment conditions are going to help us understand the how, the where, and the who to help us build the assessments. Performance evidence is going to tell us what we need to see the candidate do or produce. And the knowledge evidence is going to help us know what assessment questions to create to test that information. Okay, hopefully that's made sense for you. Question 8, describe how you would trial and review a newly developed assessment tool. Okay, so essentially there's a number of different ways that we could review an assessment tool. Number one could be validation. Okay, another one could be self-reflection and actually looking at the assessment and checking it against the mapping, checking it against the quality of answers that you're getting. Okay. Now, another one, like we're talking about trialing here. So you could actually give the assessment to a colleague and say, could you give me your feedback on this assessment? You could also give it to industry experts and they could give you feedback. You could ask your training and assessment manager for their feedback on it. You could, as we always say, include it as part of your 6-monthly validation. Okay. But essentially trialing it is using it before you use it on real life candidates. So you could trial it on a colleague, co-worker, past student. Doesn't happen very often, but it could. And yeah, or even a current student. All right, that would work, but you wouldn't use it as a actual assessment, but you could use it as a test example or a test run or, so yeah, there's some ideas for you. Question 9, what is the principle of reasonable adjustment? How much do you apply it in the development of a quality assessment tool? Okay, so reasonable adjustment is any modification to the training or assessment method used to allow for any physical, mental, or geographic disadvantage or disability that a learner may have. So I'll say it again. Hopefully I repeat it absolutely correctly, but and the same way. But reasonable adjustment is any modification to the training or assessment method to allow for any physical, mental, or geographic disadvantage or disability that a learner may have. Okay. So that is essentially the concept that we are going to build into our assessments different strategies so that nobody is left behind and no one's disadvantaged based on any physical, mental, or physical, mental, or geographic disadvantage or disability. Now, let's unpack that. So physical could be maybe they do have a disability. Okay, maybe they are in a wheelchair, maybe they can't write, maybe they can't read, maybe they've got visual impairment. Okay, mental could be ADHD, maybe they've got like mental illness or different or psychological stuff going on. What else have we got? Geographic. Maybe they can't actually attend the actual physical training. And we need to take that into consideration as well. So that's geographic. Okay, so but the most common ones or the most common ways that reasonable adjustment comes up is talking about the disability side of things. All right, so we would want to always, when we build our assessments, build in reasonable strategies that somebody with any disability may have can still complete the assessment. Or we want to put in at least some instructions on how that may look like or what they may look like. So how must you apply it in the development of a quality assessment tool? My answer would be something like, the principle of reasonable adjustment is blah, 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 blah. Then in order to apply this to the development of a quality assessment tool, we will put in clear instructions about how, under what circumstances reasonable adjustment can be applied and what is the procedure for a candidate to apply for reasonable adjustment, and the policy and procedure for the assessor to actually apply reasonable adjustment. And then I may even go a little bit above and beyond to give some examples, such as an example of reasonable adjustment might be if a candidate has trouble writing, they may be provided with a scribe. Okay, that's just a simple example that comes to mind. Okay. Question 10, list and describe at least three things you could consider regarding how you'd implement and run the assessment to inform the instructions you would include for an assessor. List and describe at least three things you should consider regarding how you'd implement and run the assessment to inform the instructions you would include for an assessor. Okay, so let's go. Number one would be equipment. Okay. So essentially, what would you mention around equipment? Well, possibly you'd mention around how it needs to be maintained, how it needs to be used, the instructions for startup, the instructions for safety, and what else comes to mind with maintenance? Maybe making sure that the equipment is cleaned, those kind of things. All right. What else have we got? Maybe let's go marking of assessment. So in relation to that, you may talk about how the answers are to be marked, when they're to be marked, what is the pass mark, when the student is to submit the assessment, how they're meant to submit it, and how to check for plagiarism, those kind of things. Okay. So obviously, as I'm saying these things, I'd be making notes and then filling these answers out in your own words and your own detail. Listen and describe at least three things. All right. So what's another one? Let's dovetail off that last one that I said there is plagiarism and copying. Okay. So have I spelled it correctly? Not sure. Let's change that. So plagiarism and copying. So in here, you could say, put in some instructions as to what to do if an assessor comes across plagiarism and copying, and how to handle that situation. Okay, some instructions for that. Okay, another one that comes to mind is safety. Okay, so what are some instructions that you would give to the assessor on how to conduct the assessment safely? All right. So you may mention things like making sure that the candidate does a inspection of the assessment area and completing a hazard inspection report, and making sure that both them and the candidate are wearing the appropriate PPE. Okay, so those are all those different things that you can talk about, and there's many other different things that you would want to consider when you implement and run an assessment. Okay, so coming down, question 11, for each of the four listed components of an RTO's assessment system, describe what you would include in the assessor's instructions on an assessment tool to ensure that the RTO's assessment systems are applied. Okay, now in here in question 11, we are actually going to put in the specific instructions we would actually say. All right, so we're going to talk directly to the instructions. And version control. Okay, I'm not going to write it in, but I want you to think what I'll say it, but I'm not going to write it in for you. I'd like you to think about what actual instructions would you say to a user of the assessment. Okay, so if it was me, I might write something like, when you are choosing the assessment, make sure that you have the latest version. And anytime that you update this assessment, please make sure that you update the version number and the date. Okay, full stop. So it could be something to that effect. All right, and you can choose different wording, totally up to you. Retrieval of assessment tools. In here, you may put in words such as when you are selecting the assessment tools, make sure that you select them from the cloud server and the LMS, and make sure that you have the appropriate assessments on hand, and make sure that you print them off and provide them to the candidate and collect them straight after the assessment, or something to that effect. Okay, so retrieval of assessment tools is essentially, where do people get them from? Okay, where does the assessor access them from? Okay, storage of candidates assessment, how and for how long? In here, instructions could be something like, after the candidate has completed the assessment, make sure that you store it on the XYZ server, or on the student's file, which is located on SharePoint, or which is located on Moodle, or whatever system your ITO is using, on the student file, and make sure that it is kept for a minimum of 6 months, and that all information is saved and backed up on an external hard drive. Okay, something to that effect. Okay, every RTO is going to handle this portion a little bit differently. So we are just looking for, where would people save the candidate's assessment? Evaluation and validation. In here, instructions could be something like, assessments will be moderated and validated every 6 months, and stakeholder engagement will be conducted as part of the assessment creation process. What else? We will also gather feedback from learners as to how they found the assessments, and we will evaluate assessment tool performance over and make changes to the continuous improvement log. Okay, or something to that effect. All right, essentially we're talking about, how will you evaluate the quality of the assessments, and how often will validation take place? Okay, so if we come down, all right, so number 12, for each of the four listed general WHS responsibilities associated with assessing competence, briefly describe how you can address them in the design and content of your assessment tool. Okay, so hazards requirements for hazard reporting and incidents. In there, you could say something like, prior to undertaking the assessment, hazard reports must be completed and an inspection of the area must be done. Okay. Emergency procedures, in there you could say something like, the assessor is to familiarize themselves with the emergency evacuation procedure and make sure that the candidate knows what the emergency evacuation procedures are, and make sure that the student and the assessor make each other aware of any new hazards that arise during the assessment process. Okay. Procedures for use of personal protective equipment. Well, in here, we want to make sure that there is an induction process for the student knowing how to put on the PPE, for the assessor to be able to put on the PPE, what PPE is required, how it is to be worn, and those kind of details. Okay. Source of WHS information. Well, this could simply list out, where is the WHS information going to come from? So it could be the WHS manual for the company. It could be policies and procedures for the company. It could be essentially, where are people going to find the safety information? Okay. So if we come down, number 13 here, it says, consider the assessment principle of flexibility. Alrighty, so if we come down to question 13 here, we're talking about the assessment principle of flexibility. Now, assessment flexibility can also occasionally touch on reasonable adjustment, but it's normally related to reasonable adjustment normally comes under the heading of fairness more so. But in this case, we are talking about different scenarios that fall under the heading of also flexibility, okay? So we're asking you to think about what are the actual instructions that you would provide in these scenarios, okay? So write your instructions in the space provided. For this example, there are no extra requirements for the assessment. The candidates are within the range expected for foundation skills. There are no extra physical requirements that would otherwise prohibit the successful completion of their assessment, blah, blah, blah. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to create some instructions for the candidate based on this scenario, this situation. So a candidate with low literacy on numeracy skills, new to the industry, to be provided an oral assessment. So in here, we would write some instructions such as, and to the assessor and to the candidate. So we would say something like, assessor is to provide provide the written assessment in the form of an oral assessment, and is required to ask each of the questions verbally and write down the candidate's answers. Okay. If it's the candidate's instructions, we would say, candidate is to answer the following questions verbally, and you are to answer them to the best of your ability, and the assessor will write down your answers. Okay, so that's essentially what we'd put in terms of the instructions. Okay, coming down to the next one, a candidate with a physical disability, in this case, in this instance, they are restricted to a wheelchair, undertaking a classroom-based written assessment. So instructions to the assessor might be something like, when you are setting up the assessment, please make sure that the table is, or the furniture is at the appropriate height for any candidate that finds themselves in a wheelchair or is in a wheelchair. And please make sure that appropriate space is created in the training room for the candidate to be able to complete the test. Okay. A candidate aged over 65 years with limited computer literacy undertaking online assessment. Okay, so in here we could say something like, for any candidates that find completing the assessment via online assessment, find it challenging, you may request the online assessment via PDF and would be allowed to handwrite your answers. Okay. Yeah, probably that's the best instructions we can give them. Okay. So coming down, question 14, choose one performance criteria from a unit of competency. Describe how you would address all 4 rules of evidence using an assessment activity for that performance criteria. If you're able to discuss your ideas with others, considering alternative approaches. Okay. So Unicode, basically, you're going to pick any unit of competency, one that you're familiar with, then pick a PC, or performance criteria, and then discuss how you are going to make sure that you hit the rules of evidence. Okay. So let me quickly run you through an example. Awesome. So on the screen that we've got here, I have gone to training.gov.au and I've picked out the unit BSB OPS 304, deliver and monitor a service to customers. All right, you can pick any unit at all. It's totally fine. So I've come down here and I have gone with, let's go Let's go 1.1, identify and clarify customer needs and expectations. All right, so identify customer needs. So we got 1.1. I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to come back to our document and bring that up. All right, so PC 1.1. Let's see if I can spell it correctly. PC 1.1. Okay. BSB OPS 304, I believe it was. All right. So just for the sake of ease, I'm just going to put it there so we can see what's going on. All right. So valid. How are we going to address that with the 4 rules of assessment? Well, probably to keep it valid, I might say, all right, set up a role play or scenario in which a candidate is required to demonstrate identifying and clarifying customer needs and expectations. This could be done in a retail environment, or what watching someone on the telephone, having a conversation in which this is one of the criteria. Okay, so that's essentially going to make sure that it's definitely valid and it's definitely covered off. Authentic. Well, how do we make sure that it's actually the candidate doing that? Well, we would want to include a student declaration, and they sign the observation checklist form. Okay. Current. Well, we would want to make sure that the date is included on the assessment. Okay. And then sufficient, maybe the candidate is observed more than once. Okay, so essentially that's going to make sure that that criteria is covered off. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and that process that I've gone through can support you in helping you understand this question. All right, I could have picked out any performance criteria and described it. You can certainly pick, a completely different unit, such as, organizing meetings or making presentations or first aid or whatever unit you would like to pick out, and pick out any PC, and then think about, well, how would you assess that? How would you make sure that it is authentic, it is a candidate's own work? How would you make sure that the evidence they produce or they do in front of you is up to date? And how would you make sure that there is enough of it for the assessor to make a decision? Okay. So that, folks, is the end of the short answer questions. And do make sure that you do fill out the very bottom here, candidate name and signature, and put the date. Okay, so hopefully this video has been helpful, and hopefully as we've gone through it, you've been taking notes, and feel free to rewatch the video if you need to multiple times to just let the ideas sink in. As always, if you get stuck at any time, feel free to email us and we are more than happy to help you out. Okay, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you around at a course, or we will look forward to connecting with you very soon.